Welcome. Now we begin chapter 22. Rebirth and other worlds. Karma, the soul, and immortality. There are 3 Upanishadic citations and a 4th, which is from the Rig Veda. This first one is from the Taittiriya Upanishad, virtually all the way to the end of it. He passes in his departure from this world to the physical self. He passes to the self of life. He passes to the self of mind. He passes to the self of knowledge. He passes to the self of bliss. He moves through these worlds at will. Physical self, Annamaya. Self of life, Pranamaya. Self of mind, Manomaya. Self of knowledge, Vijnana Maya, which Sri Aurobindo and other contexts, of course, interprets as supermind. And then he passes to the self of bliss, Anandamaya. So we have here that order of the worlds as they ascend, which has been so central to Sri Aurobindo's explanation about how this world is a manifestation of the divine in graded planes, and the soul, as he has described, has not simply one inning upon earth, but moves through all of these worlds, but stabilizes his evolutionary path in a physical embodiment. Otherwise, why not stay above? It is for the purpose of evolution, for the realization of a deep cosmic urge to marry matter and spirit, that the soul, key to the whole process, takes birth. I might say that at the end of this passage, which Sri Aurobindo translates, the Upanishad continues and says about the sage who has this realization, he sits singing this chant, Hau, Hau, Hau. Oh, wonderful, oh, wonderful, oh, wonderful. And then describes how he moves through all the worlds, a free spirit, enjoying this, experiencing that, being eaten, eating himself. Sometimes the role leads to a new consecration of being, but always in this awakened soul there is joy. Whether one serves, whether one leads, is immaterial. To be awake to the wonder of it all. The completion of the soul's task. But then, it does not pass away. It does not go into some other world and simply retire. It continues to transport itself through all the many planes. Taittiriya Upanishad, often called the Upanishad of bliss, because Ananda is central to its whole thesis. The next, of course, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the oldest, the largest of the Upanishads. They say indeed that the conscious being, Purusha, is made of desire, Kama. But of whatsoever desire he comes to be of that will, and of whatever will he comes to be, He does that action, and whatever action, to the result of that, he reaches. Adhered to by his karma, he goes in his subtle body to wherever his mind cleaves, then, coming to the end of his karma, even of whatsoever action he does here, he returns from that world to this world for karma. This is interesting because this is a couple of verses. These are a couple of verses which come right after the famous images of the caterpillar and the gold metaphor in explaining how one disposes of a body and continues on to another. Worth rereading that. Now, it's interesting. You can translate this as for karma or of karma. Sri Aurobindo's translation brings us back to the significance of karma. Hence his footnote here, action, karma. In the view expressed in this verse of the Upanishad, the karma or action of this life is exhausted by the life in the world beyond, in which its results are fulfilled, and the soul returns to earth for fresh karma. The cause of birth in this world, of karma, of the soul's passage to other world existence and its return here is, throughout, the soul's own consciousness, will, and desire. In other words, in this passage offered by Yajnavalkya, the great sage, he is saying that when you go there, in that heavenly world above, the karma that you created here is exhausted, nullified. That sack is empty. But you come back, and you come back for karma, to act, not compelled by previous actions, but to undertake it willingly. And as Sri Aurobindo points out, referring to earlier in the verse, it's because we choose, the Purusha chooses to do this. It's his intent, his will, his desire, a desire to enter into the cosmos. Not a craven, coarse desire, but some grand experiment to be undertaken. And now the third, equipped with qualities, gunas, a doer of works and creator of their consequences, pala karma karta, he reaps the result of his actions. He is the ruler of the life, and he moves in his journey according to his own acts. He has idea, sankalpa, and ego, ahankara, and is to be known by the qualities of his intelligence and his quality of self. Smaller than the 100th part of the tip of a hair, the soul of the living being is capable of infinity, anantya. Male is he not, nor female, nor neuter, but is joined to whatever body he takes as his own. The soul of the living being, bhago jivaha, that living being whose nature is delight, enjoyment. Small, but capable of being vast, just like the divine. We put on the divine's nature. And then finally, the passage from the Rig Veda. Mortals, they achieved immortality. That means passing from the state in which one knows one is going to die, or when one is compelled to death, to that state in which one knows oneself to be beyond death. It need not imply physical immortality, but a knowledge that what you really are is not the body, but an immortal essence. By the way, the opening of this verse says something like this. When they have served with enthusiasm, with zeal, at the yajna, at the sacrifice, mortals, they achieved immortality. What is the sacrifice? It is not simply the offering of a fruit or a gift or something into the fire, but that act represents your conscious work in the world, no? So what you're doing when you make the sacrifice, when you attend the yajna and do it well and do it fully and do it consciously, is to offer the essence, the sap of your own experience of life. And that is what leads you, the mortal, to discover and become immortality and an immortal. So, let's begin the chapter. Our first conclusion on the subject of reincarnation has been that the rebirth of the soul in successive terrestrial bodies is an inevitable consequence of the original significance and process of the manifestation in earth nature. But this conclusion leads to farther problems and farther results which it is necessary to elucidate. There arises first the question of the process of rebirth. If that process is not quickly successive, birth immediately following death of the body so as to maintain an uninterrupted series of lives of the same person, if there are intervals, that in its turn raises the question of the principle and process of the passage to other worlds, which must be the scene of these intervals and the return to earth life. A third question is the process of the spiritual evolution itself and the mutations which the soul undergoes in its passage from birth to birth through the stages of its adventure. So is it quick? If it's not quick, an immediate transmigration, but there is a sojourn to other worlds, what's that process like? And then what's the nature of the spiritual evolution that demands this process? If the physical universe were the sole manifested world, or if it were a quite separate world, rebirth as a part of the evolutionary process would be confined to a constant succession of direct transmigrations from one body to another. Death would be immediately followed by a new birth without any possibility of an interval. The passage of the soul would be a spiritual circumstance in the uninterrupted series of a compulsory mechanical material procedure. The soul would have no freedom from matter. It would be perpetually bound to its instrument, the body, and dependent on it for the continuity of its manifested existence. But we have found that there is a life on other planes after death and before the subsequent rebirth. a life consequent on the old and preparatory of the new stage of terrestrial existence. Other planes coexist with ours, are part of one complex system, and act constantly upon the physical, which is their own final and lowest term, receive its reactions, admit a secret communication and commerce. Man can become conscious of these planes, can even, in certain states, project his conscious being into them, partly in life, presumably therefore with a full completeness after the dissolution of the body. Such a possibility of projection into other worlds or planes of being becomes then sufficiently actual to necessitate practically its own realization, immediately and perhaps invariably following on human earth life, if man is from the beginning endowed with such a power of self-transference. Eventual, if he only arrives at it by a gradual progression. For it is possible that at the beginning he would not be sufficiently developed to carry on his life or his mind into larger life worlds or mind worlds, and would be compelled to accept an immediate transmigration from one earthly body to another as his only present possibility of persistence. So, early on, when we have reached the stage of human evolution, it may be necessary for us to be propelled from birth to birth to birth, until we have built sufficient soul strength that we can keep everything together and depart from this world without losing the coherence of that stream. The context, as he's established in recent chapters, certainly in the last chapter, is that all of these worlds play upon each other necessarily. The world here that we inhabit, the material, is evolving, but has within it all of the planes of existence. They continue, of course, to exist as typal realities above, and beings and worlds exist, which are not in direct interface with our material world, but are in subtle interface with them, can pour their influences and lights and energies into us through the screened subliminal, and so can have a powerful impact upon us. Indeed, a necessary role do they play in cosmic evolution. So let's continue. The necessity for an interregnum between birth and a passage to other worlds arises from a double cause. There is an attraction of the other planes for the mental and the vital being in man's composite nature due to their affinity with these levels, and there is the utility, or even the need of an interval for assimilation of the completed life experience, a working out of what has to be discarded, a preparation for the new embodiment and the new terrestrial experience. So first, the life parts, the mind parts in us, when they've quit the material encasement, want to go home. But it's good for us to go there also, because there are things we have to slough off, baggage that we have to set down, things that we have to arrange and put away, perhaps for future reference. But this need of a period of assimilation, and this attraction of other worlds for kindred parts of our being, may become effective only when the mental and vital individuality has been sufficiently developed in the half-animal physical man. Until then, they might not exist or might not be active. The life experiences would be too simple and elementary to need assimilation, and the natural being too crude to be capable of a complex assimilative process. The higher parts would not be sufficiently developed to lift themselves to higher planes of existence. There can be, then, in the absence of such connections with other worlds, a theory of rebirth which admits only of a constant transmigration. Here, the existence of other worlds and the sojourn of the soul in other planes are not an actual or at any stage a necessary part of the system. That's one. There can be another theory in which this passage is the obligatory rule for all, and there is no immediate rebirth. The soul needs an interval of preparation for the new incarnation and new experience. That's the second. A compromise between the two theories is also possible. The transmigration may be the first rule prevailing while the soul is yet unripe for a higher world existence. The passage to other planes would be the subsequent law. There may even be a third stage, as is sometimes suggested, in which the soul is so powerfully developed, its natural parts so spiritually alive, that it needs no interval, but can immediately resume birth for a more rapid evolution without the retardation of a period of intermittence. And this by way of comment that while it is mentioned, of course, that great souls sometimes accept rebirth only when centuries have transpired on earth, it is also true that one who has reached fullness, completeness, can, if it is in alignment with the cosmic will, take an immediate rebirth, not out of compulsion, not because nature demands it. It's not part of the tutelary experience, but because he sees the need and says, I will go again. Work is incomplete. In the popular ideas, which derive from the religions that admit reincarnation, there is an inconsistency which, after the manner of popular beliefs, they have been at no pains to reconcile. On the one hand, there is the belief, vague enough but fairly general, that death is followed immediately or with something like immediateness by the assumption of another body. On the other hand, there is the old religious dogma of a life after death in hells and heavens, or it may be in other worlds or degrees of being, which the soul has acquired or incurred by its merits or demerits in this physical existence. The return to earth intervenes only when that merit and demerit are exhausted, and the being is ready for another terrestrial life. This inconsistency would disappear if we admit a variable movement dependent on the stage of evolution which the soul has reached in its manifestation in nature. All would then turn on the degree of its capacity for entering a higher status than the earthly life. But in the ordinary notion of reincarnation, the idea of a spiritual evolution is not explicit. It is only implied in the fact that the soul has to reach the point at which it becomes capable of transcending the necessity of rebirth and returning to its eternal source. But if there is no gradual and graded evolution, This point can be as well reached by a chaotic zigzag movement of which the law is not easily determinable. The definitive solution of the question depends on psychic inquiry and experience. Here we can only consider whether there is in the nature of things or in the logic of the evolutionary process any apparent or inherent necessity for either movement, for the immediate transition from body to body, or for the retardation or interval before a new reincarnation of the self-embodying psychic principle. So if there is no evolution, well, then transmigration works. You may as well just jump from A to Z and back to M and over to O. It won't matter. But if there is an evolution, and this we can know most tellingly through our own awakening, through our own experience, to become yogins, to become sages, and know the substance of our own being, the substance of the becoming we inhabit, the nature of the cosmic soul, the nature of the cosmic becoming, and know things in their fine principles all the way to their roots. If we can gather such knowledge, and it is a vast requirement, then we can determine, we can speak intelligently to the question of what is it that the soul is doing, where is it going? Why does it have to acquire, in a sense, cosmic permission to be able to reside in these interior supraphysical planes during the internatal period between death and birth? A sort of half necessity for the life in other worlds, a dynamic and practical rather than an essential necessity, arises from the very fact that the different world principles are interwoven with each other and, in a way, interdependent, and the effect that this fact must have upon the process of our spiritual evolution. But this might be counteracted for a time by the greater pull or attraction of the earth or the preponderant physicality of the evolving nature. Our belief in the birth of an ascending soul into the human form and its repeated rebirth in that form, without which it cannot complete its human evolution, rests from the point of view of the reasoning intelligence on the basis that the progressive transit of the soul into higher and higher grades of the earthly existence, and once it has reached the human level, its repeated human birth, compose a sequence necessary for the growth of the nature. One brief human life upon earth is evidently insufficient for the evolutionary purpose. In the early stages of a series of human reincarnations, during a period of rudimentary humanity, there is a certain possibility at first sight of an often repeated immediate transmigration, the repeated assumption of a new human form in a fresh birth immediately the previous body has been dissolved by a cessation or expulsion of the organized life energy and the consequent physical disintegration, which we call death. So, as the evolving psyche reaches the stage of human evolution, maybe there will be quite a number of birth after birth after birth, the process of transmigration, may as well call it that, where one is compelled to move back into another human body to build the reservoir of experience which would be necessary to get to larger tasks which wait it. But what necessity of the evolutionary process would compel such a series of immediate births? Of immediate rebirths? Evidently, it could only be imperative so long as the psychic individuality, not the secret soul entity itself, but the soul formation in the natural being, is little evolved, insufficiently developed, so insufficiently formed that it could not abide except by dependence upon the uninterrupted continuance of this life's mental, vital, and physical individuality. Unable as yet to persist in itself, discard its past mind formation and life formation, and build, after a useful interval, new formations, it would be obliged to transfer at once its rudimentary, crude personality for preservation to a new body. I'm sure you catch that machinery. That's easy enough. But look at what he has just said. Not the secret soul entity itself, not the psychic essence, but the soul formation, the psychic personality which is being built, which is an interface between the essence and the world at large. That is the thing which we have to carefully construct and which proceeds from birth to birth with us. It is doubtful whether we should be justified in attributing any such entirely insufficient development to a being so strongly individualized that it has got as far as the human consciousness. Even at its lowest normality, the human individual is still a soul acting through a distinct mental being, however ill-formed his mind may be, however limited and dwarfed, however engrossed and encased in the physical and vital consciousness, and unable or unwilling to detach itself from its lower formations. Yet, we may suppose that there is a downward attachment so strong as to compel the being to hasten at once to a resumption of the physical life, because his natural formation is not really fit for anything else or at home on any higher plane. Or again, the life experience might be so brief and incomplete as to compel the soul to an immediate rebirth for its continuance. So you have both of those possibilities. You're just not able to dwell on that yet because those inner parts have not been sufficiently developed, or this incarnation was too brief to have amassed anything worth cogitating about. Other needs, influences, or causes there may be in the complexity of nature process, such as a strong will of earthly desire pressing for fulfillment, which would enforce an immediate transmigration of the same persistent form of personality into a new body. Just can't put it down. It just owns you, that desire. But still, the alternative process of a reincarnation, a rebirth of the person, not only into a new body, but into a new formation of the personality, would be the normal line taken by the psychic entity once it had reached the human stage of its evolutionary cycle. So yes, normally we are not compelled to go from birth to birth immediately in a process of transmigration. There is a period in which we resolve ourselves to higher worlds and digest the fruits of our experiences on each of those planes. For the soul personality, as it develops, must get sufficient power over its own nature formation and a sufficient self-expressive mental and vital individuality to persist without the support of the material body, as well as to overcome any excessive detaining attachment to the physical plane and the physical life. It would be sufficiently evolved to subsist in the subtle body, which we know to be the characteristic case or sheath, and the proper subtle physical support of the inner being. It is the soul person, the psychic being, that survives and carries mind and life with it on its journey. And it is in the subtle body that it passes out of its material lodging. Both, then, must be sufficiently developed for the transit. But a transference to planes of mind existence or life existence implies also a mind and life sufficiently formed and developed to pass without disintegration and exist for a time on these higher levels. If these conditions were satisfied, a sufficiently developed psychic personality and subtle body, and a sufficiently developed mental and vital personality, survival of the soul person without an immediate new birth would be secured, and the pull of the other worlds would become operative. So if we build up life power, mind power, and if they are bound correctly, let's say tethered successfully to the subtle physical, then they can successfully escape the pull of that physical world and gain access to above, because we are being drawn there. As this physical body is laid down, those worlds are beckoning, saying, welcome back, welcome back. So through the subtle physical, Sukshma Sharira, in that shining, radiant garment, we are able to transport ourselves towards and into these supraphysical planes, life planes, eventually mind planes, and dwell there and be happily rejoined with the source of those energies and lights. But this by itself, he says, would mean a return to earth with the same mental and vital personality, and there would be no free evolution in the new birth. So even this sketch is insufficient to the larger scheme. There must be an individuation of the psychic person itself, sufficient for it not to depend on its past mind and life formations any more than on its past body, but to shed them too in time and proceed to a new formation for new experience. For this discarding of the old and preparation of new forms, the soul must dwell for some time between two births, somewhere else than on the entirely material plane in which we now move. For here, there would be no abiding place for a disembodied spirit. So he's forcing us to the conclusion that there is a psychic entity, a being, something around which the life and mind parts cohere so that they can successfully exist and return to these subtler planes. A brief stay, he says, might be possible if there are subtle envelopes of the earth existence which belong to earth but are of a vital or mental character. But even then, there would be no reason for the soul to linger there for a long period unless it is still burdened with an overpowering attachment to the earth life. A survival of the material body by the personality implies a supraphysical existence, and this can only be in some plane of being proper to the evolutionary stage of the consciousness, or, if there is no evolution, in a temporary second home of the spirit, which would be its natural place of sojourn between life and life, unless indeed it is its original world from which it does not return into material nature. So he's conceding to other religious ideas that after death you get to go to some heaven beyond because that's your native place. It's a simpler view, and as he's noted earlier, the idea of the fuller evolution of the soul on earth is not recognized by, let us say, the major religions. Where then would the temporary dwelling in the supraphysical take place? What would be the soul's other habitat? It might seem that it ought to be on a mental plane, in mental worlds, both because on man, the mental being, the attraction of that plane already active in life must prevail when there is not the obstacle of the attachment to the body, and because the mental plane should be evidently the native and proper habitat of a mental being. But this does not automatically follow because of the complexity of man's being. He has a vital as well as a mental existence. His vital part, often more powerful and prominent than the mental. And behind the mental being is a soul of which it is the representative. There are, besides, many planes or levels of world existence, and the soul has to pass through them to reach its natural home. In the physical plane itself, or close to it, there are believed to be layers of greater and greater subtlety, which may be regarded as subplanes of the physical with a vital and a mental character. These are at once surrounding and penetrating strata through which the interchange between the higher worlds and the physical world takes place. It might then be possible for the mental being, so long as its mentality is not sufficiently developed, so long as it is restricted mainly to the more physical forms of mind and life activity, to be caught and delayed in these media. It might even be obliged to rest there entirely between birth and birth. But this is not probable, and could only happen if and insofar as its attachment to the earth forms of its activity was so great as to preclude or hamper the completion of the natural upward movement. For the post-mortal state of the soul must correspond in some way to the development of the being on earth, since this afterlife is not a free upward return from a temporary downward deviation into mortality, but a normal recurrent circumstance which intervenes to help out the process of a difficult spiritual evolution in the physical existence. There is a relation which the human being in his evolution on earth develops with higher planes of existence, and that must have a predominant effect on his internatal dwelling in these planes. It must determine his direction after death, and determine, too, the place, period, and character of his self-experience there. So these subtle interplays, these fields which come into conjoint creation, we'll continue to analyze as we move forward. But I think this is a good place to put your bookmarks for this session. And we'll turn to Savitri. And here, this time read from Book 2, the Book of the Traveler of the Worlds, in Canto 2, the Kingdom of Subtle Matter. Only when we have climbed above ourselves, a line of the transcendent meets our road and joins us to the timeless and the true. It brings to us the inevitable word, the godlike act, the thoughts that never die. A ripple of light and glory wraps the brain, and traveling down the moment's vanishing route, the figures of eternity arrive. As the mind's visitors or the heart's guests, they espouse our mortal brevity a while, or seldom, in some rare delivering glimpse, are caught by our vision's delicate surmise. Although beginnings only and first attempts, these glimmerings point to the secret of our birth and the hidden miracle of our destiny. What we are there, and here on earth shall be, is imaged in a contact and a call. As yet, earth's imperfection is our sphere. Our nature's glass shows not our real self. That greatness still abides held back within. Earth's doubting future hides our heritage. The light, now distant, shall grow native here. The strength that visits us, our comrade power. The ineffable shall find a secret voice. The imperishable burn through matter's screen, making this mortal body Godhead's robe. The Spirit's greatness is our timeless source, and it shall be our crown in endless time. A vast unknown is round us and within. All things are wrapped in the dynamic one. A subtle link of union joins all life. Thus, all creation is a single chain. We are not left alone in a closed scheme between a driving of inconscient force and an incommunicable absolute. Our life is a spur in a sublime soul range. Our being looks beyond its walls of mind, and it communicates with greater worlds. There are brighter earths and wider heavens than ours. There are realms where being broods in its own depths. It feels in its immense dynamic core its nameless, unformed, unborn potencies cry for expression in the unshaped vast. Ineffable beyond ignorance and death, the images of its everlasting truth look out from a chamber of its self-wrapped soul. As if to its own inner witness gaze, the Spirit holds up its mirrored self and works, the power and passion of its timeless heart, the figures of its formless ecstasy, the grandeurs of its multitudinous might. Thence comes the mystic substance of our souls into the prodigy of our nature's birth. There is the unfallen height of all we are, and dateless fount of all we hope to be. Namaste. Jai Ma.